Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football week 9, and we've officially passed the midseason point. College football playoff rankings revealed for the first time next week. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host and college football diehard, the one, the only Payne Insider. Payne, how goes it this morning?
I'm trying to figure out where all this slander's coming from suddenly in week 9. What's going on?
There's no such thing as slander. It's terms of endearment for how much you live and breathe the college game. Florida State back in action as more than a 3-touchdown favorite this weekend. The sun came up on Monday morning. It's a good week.
There you go. I'm just trying to figure it out. I'm trying to gravitate towards being a little bit more passionate about college football.
Yeah,
and in my process of trying, you're just trying to crush my confidence.
Not here to crush anyone's confidence. We're here to be dream weavers, dream builders, and prop everyone up. When you look at the college football landscape, an interesting slate of games this weekend. Not a ton of marquee matchups, but obviously we continue to figure out where some of these teams are trending. So without further ado, we may as welcome in the third member of our Holy Trinity. He joins us every Wednesday here on the Bet the Board podcast. You, of course, can follow Brad Powers on Twitter at BradPower7. And Brad, well, we have a laundry list of big games to get to. It may not be the most attractive college football slate we've ever seen on a Saturday. I got to start with the hard-hitting questions right off the top. When you look at the national landscape, clearly there are 3 teams that are significantly better than everyone else: Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State. When you look at that trio as far as a pecking order, how do you see those 3? And then we'll get into the rest of the landscape.
Yeah, I have Ohio State number 1 in my power ratings, and about a point better than number 2 Georgia. And then I have Alabama down a little bit after that. I mean, I have Alabama 4 points worse than Georgia. Now, if I'm a bookmaker, am I hanging Georgia 4 against Alabama, knowing full well I would take a ton of Alabama money? No. But I think clearly Ohio State's, 1, Georgia 2, although I question the schedule strength for the Bulldogs. And then Alabama, even last week in a cover against Mississippi State, I was not impressed with what they did offensively. So Alabama B3.
You mentioned the schedule strength, and I think we're obviously going to get a better indication of where the Scarlet and Gray are in Ohio State when they go on the road to Beaver Stadium on Saturday. Did you have any major takeaways from the lackluster, I guess is probably the nicest way to put it, offensive showing against an Iowa team that offered no threat offensively, but for the first time all season, we saw C.J. Stroud and that offense look frustrated for at least the better part of 2.5, maybe even 3 quarters before they busted that game wide open.
Maybe a little bit of concerns, but I mean, I get it. The storyline about Iowa's been their offense. They still play really good defense there, and when you look at the final stats, I mean, obviously the scoreboard looks good. Final stats don't look good. Ohio State only had 66 rushing yards in the game, but I also think they they didn't have a long ways to go on a lot of those, after turnovers, as far as having to go long distances to put points on the board. So I still think there's a little bit of a feeling out process because they haven't been at full strength all season for Ohio State. So, when you're playing the Arkansas States and the Toledos of the world, and then you finally face, a defense that can stop you a little bit, certainly I wasn't that surprised that they struggled a little bit. I mean, there was a reason why the total was sitting there at 49 or 50.
Yeah, it's about as low a total as you're going to see with the Buckeyes all season long. And Payne, during that game, I mean, we were kind of texting with some questions about C.J. Stroud's reads and if he looked like he was fully engaged. But maybe more importantly, and again, I know we're going to cover the Buckeyes in greater detail, if you're Ryan Day, why are you not just resting Jackson Smith and Jigba, knowing that it's the Michigan game at the end of the regular season, the Big Ten championship and subsequent playoff, instead of playing Russian roulette with that hamstring that's clearly limited his ability to stretch the field as a vertical threat?
I think that's the biggest question, right? And I know we are going to break this game down shortly, and a lot of these talking points will be included in that. But you saw, I mean, Smith and Jigba sat out a couple weeks, comes back, and he goes out again. It's like your goal here at this point is making it to the college football playoff. Get this guy ready for Michigan, because that seems to be the tallest task, and make sure that he's 100%, because the rest of the receiver group, I know they're highly touted. Fleming obviously had the explosive last week. He has not lived up to billing. And Harrison, I think, is a fine receiver, but we've seen some issues with him specifically separating from man coverage. Fantastic against zone, but when he's asked to be that number one guy consistently beating man, he hasn't shown that. And without Smith and Jigba, the offense certainly has some moments where you're like, this doesn't look or feel quite right, and it doesn't necessarily align with what the metrics are indicating.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing, because you talk about playing a soft schedule early on as far as non-conference opponents, and then you ease into Big Ten East play. Clearly, Ohio State doesn't measure the merits of a football season based on a division championship, a conference championship. It's a national championship or bust, especially with a roster this talented. We'll get a much better indication of where Ohio State is when they go into hostile territory this weekend with the unveiling of the college football playoff committee rankings next week. I believe those come out on Tuesday. But Brad, before we get there, when you're looking at some of the other teams potentially in the mix within the top 10, how do you have teams, let's say 4 through 7 ranked, and have there been any major movers in that group since the start of the season for you?
Yeah, number 4, I had Michigan. I mean, another team like Georgia and Ohio State where we could probably, pinpoint that they haven't played the strongest of schedules so far this season, but they've went out and did what they've had to do, with the exception of maybe the first half against Maryland. And I mean, consistently, offensively and defensively, and that's what kind of separates them from the number 5 team. Obviously, Tennessee's got arguably the best offense along with Ohio State in the country, but defensively, the Volunteers leave a little bit to be desired there. So they're number 5. They've been the biggest mover, jumping from borderline top 10 team. I believe I had them 11th at the start of the season. Now they're up to 5 for Tennessee, so I've upgraded them about 5.5 points. Clemson's at 6. They're unbeaten, but I've downgraded Clemson since the start of the season. A team that doesn't do anything, I would say, exceptionally well. I mean, they do a lot of things. They're a good team. I just don't think they're a playoff contending team. They're just not a national championship team. I'm not sure that they can win a game in the playoffs. So they'd be 6, and believe it or not, even with 3 losses, I have the Texas Longhorns 7. And I'm here to tell you, if that sounds like, oh, you got them too high, Brad, I've actually bet against Texas the last couple of weeks. And my numbers have said to play against Texas, even though I have them number 7 in the country.
It's pretty wild when you look at the Longhorns. Obviously, that's such a tantalizing mix of talent, and then you watch them go out there in Stillwater this past Saturday, build a 2-touchdown lead, and looked ill-equipped to do much of anything on the offensive side. Quinn Ewers showing how inexperienced he truly is, and when Oklahoma State was able to bottle up Bijan Robinson, everything came to a grinding halt for the Longhorns. Payne, when you look at that list of teams, your sentiments kind of mirror Brad. I mean, especially with Clemson, who it shocked me, honestly, in the wake of that narrow victory against Syracuse. Dabo Swinney didn't waste any time saying that DJU remains their starting quarterback, although it was Cade Klubnik and the injection of energy that got them over the hump in a game that looked like it could have gotten a bit squirrely in the middle of the third quarter.
The injection of energy was probably the best element Cade Klubnik brought to that game, because he wasn't much better through the air than DJU. I think that's an interesting list. To Brad's point, I have Michigan above Tennessee as well. I just think even though without some of the defensive starters they lost, in the offseason, they're a little bit more formidable on that side of the ball. And ultimately, we've seen this from Tennessee before. It's like, do they have the depth defensively? Do they have the secondary to contend against some of these offenses that are able to push the ball downfield? And I know Tennessee fans will cite the Alabama win, but you didn't win that game because you were able to stop Bryce Young in the pass attack. So ultimately, that's still the concern there when you look at Ohio State, Georgia, Alabama, Michigan, Tennessee, Clemson, that 6 teams. Of all of them, you would say the largest hole is probably Tennessee's pass defense.
Well, you mentioned Tennessee's pass defense, and there's no doubt if they took on Ohio State, you might see a total in that game of about 137 with those teams doing battle. We won't see a total quite that high, obviously, this weekend at Neyland Stadium under the lights where Tennessee will welcome in an SEC East rival. And it sounds ridiculous, guys, but it feels like every game Tennessee plays is a rival. It's Vanderbilt, it's Kentucky, it's Florida, it's Alabama. I can't even keep track for what UT calls a rival these days. But Tennessee, when you look at their full body...
It's because the sliding scale of success.
That's a very good point.
Winning like 5 games, like Vandy's your rival, and now all of a sudden you have this good year. It's like, other teams are your rival. I think that's what it is.
You know what? It's a great point, and one that I didn't think of, honestly, when you're going through and reading some of the comments from, not only players and coaches about the added level of importance. And you're looking at Tennessee right now, a 12.5-point favorite against Kentucky. Total in this game, 63.5. Those numbers remain largely unchanged from exactly where they open. When you go through the Vols' resume, look, they've already recorded 4 top 25 wins, or at least deemed to be top 25 wins at that point. They have the most impressive victory of any team in the top 5 all season with that upset win over Alabama as nearly a double-digit underdog. When you look at this point in the season, Brad, I guess the first question I have is evaluating the importance of a bye. Yes, Tennessee played UT Martin. You can view that as a bye, but Kentucky players made it sound, along with the coaching staff, that the bye came at the perfect time for them to rest, recover, and begin to do a little bit of self-scouting for what they're going to need to slow down Tennessee's high-powered offense, which may be an important factor on Will Levis and company to play a bit of keep away.
Yeah, I have very, very rarely come across any coach, no matter if it's week 2, week 5, week 10, that hasn't said, the bye. Boy, we didn't want a bye week this week. I mean, this is terrible timing for a bye week. It's always, this bye couldn't have come at a better time for us to heal up, to prep for the, the stretch of the season. Or if it's early in the season, we can, fine tune a quick things, make some quick adjustments, and do some quick self scouting. But in this instance, I do think it's when you're preparing for such a unique style of offense that Tennessee at least brings to the SEC. I mean, a lot of SEC teams just don't play this type of style. I think it does come at a good time for Kentucky. They were hit and miss, obviously, with the quarterback situation in their last 2 games. Will Levis doesn't play against South Carolina. He returns. Probably isn't quite 100% against Mississippi State, but they do their job to get the upset there. And then also, I mean, it's a team that's, kind of finding their way in the ground game. Why? Because, Christopher Rodriguez is starting to get into playing shape after missing the first 4 games of the season. He had his best performance in their last game against Mississippi State. So in this instance, I'm going to buy into Kentucky, having that extra time to prep for a unique offense and then healing up on the offense side of the ball at some of their key skill guys.
Payne, Brad mentioned Christopher Rodriguez, and obviously we know he's the straw that stirs the drink for everything Kentucky wants to do to impose their will physically. We've talked at great lengths, the 3 of us, all season long about the biggest question mark for Kentucky on the offensive side, an offensive line that lacks some of the physicality that had really become a trademark for this football program over the last couple of years. When you begin to look at the matchup here for Kentucky offensively matched up against the Tennessee defense, we've seen this Vols secondary, and hell, you hit on it no more than 5 minutes ago, talking about it being the biggest X factor for a top 5 team. Anthony Richardson absolutely carved them apart with one weapon in Justin Shorter. We saw live in person the kind of success that Bryce Young and Alabama had moving the football through the air. Would Kentucky be foolish to try and bang their head into a brick wall and give the ball 35 times to Christopher Rodriguez, more so than allowing Will Levis to drop back, show some of that potential NFL pedigree, and get guys like Tavian Robinson, who returns from injury, Berrien Brown, and Dane Key involved to use the pass to set up the run and keep Tennessee off balance?
That's the interesting component about this game, because if you just looked at it metrically, you would say that's the path. And it probably is the path. But everything that's coming out of the Kentucky camp, it's like they've divulged the game plan all week if you've listened to some of these pressers. And you just start to wonder if this is being set up or something. It just doesn't make any sense to divulge the game plan. I understand you are who you are. I do believe, to your point, this is a game where you're like, all right, Will Levis, let's see what the heck you got here. But we just know Kentucky loves running. They love running on standard downs. We know the efficiency has declined year over year, but to Brad's point, they've been trending much better with the return of Chris Rodriguez. He just brings that physical nature. The offensive line has been shuffled around a couple times this season. It looks like they have what is, their best unit to this point, but still they're outside the top 65 in line yards, opportunity rate, and stuff rate allowed. And all told, still outside the top 100 in EPA per rush. When you look at the Vols defense, obviously of the 6 teams that we talked that are the highest power rated, that's probably the biggest hole is the Vols defense, specifically in the secondary. But the saving grace for them has been their ability to stop the run and create some of these negative plays. So Tennessee right now 6th in rushing success rate defense, 7th in EPA per rush. They're 13th in stuff rate. You look at the 2 guys in the middle, and Aaron Beasley and Jeremy Banks, just complete thumpers. Jalen McCullough is back. He's coming down, into the box. He's a much better box safety than he is in coverage. So I do wonder how much success Kentucky's going to have running the ball. And that's obviously the reason for the Will Levis comment. It's like, this has got to be the game where he's able to shred Tennessee through the air. And if you just look, right, at not just like who the players are, their body shapes and styles, and how they've graded out, whether it's linebacker or corner or safety, the Vols don't have many good coverage guys, and that's why they're outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed. The other interesting element here is we talked about Tim Banks, the Vols defensive coordinator, loving to blitz. And I found some old articles, I found some old pressers. This offseason and early on in the year, there was this sentiment that Tennessee wanted to get pressure without sending heat because they knew the secondary wasn't great. Banks mentioned it in the summer. Again, players talked about it. I found this old quote. That really has not been the case, because if you go and look at what they've done against Power 5 offenses, Tim Banks has sent blitz on more than 44% of dropbacks. The last 2 games alone against Power 5 teams in Bama and LSU, Banks has sent heat, 50% of dropbacks. So I think this is where some of the variance comes in on this side of the ball. Negative plays. Kentucky's O-line still isn't great, still not very good when you look at opponent-adjusted pressure rate allowed. Kentucky's below the national average there. So can Levis get the ball out, right, and not take the sack? Something he's done a decent amount this year, because if he can get it out and not take the sack, and you can get some better pass protection from this Kentucky O-line, which is extremely questionable, Levis has actually torched the blitz when he gets the ball away. 83% adjusted accuracy, 9.3 ADOT, 124 passer rating. So that is very much like the game within the game here. What I kind of mentioned at the top was like Rick Scangarello has talked all week about shortening this game and being good on third downs. I don't necessarily love that strategy, right? But Will Levis needs to be awesome on third down. It's just completely contrasting styles here. You just look at Kentucky being dead last in the country in plays per minute. And it's all about this, we have to have, points per possession and third down conversions to really lead the way. And I don't know if that's going to work. It's such a thin razor sharp margin to kind of play that style of football. And they executed that last season, right? Go back to last year's game. Kentucky possessed the ball for 46 minutes. And I understand there was a defensive pick 6, but you still lost that game at home, and Tennessee's far superior, and I don't think you're as good as you were last year. So they employed this style last year with a much better offensive line, a much better ground game. Still came up short. So it's going to be interesting to see stylistically how Kentucky plays this one.
Yeah, if you're going to try and shorten the game, it obviously places such an emphasis on being able to execute. Scoring 7s, not settling for 3s if you're Kentucky, because Tennessee will get their points and you're going to have to match them score for score. Brad, when you look at the other side of the ball, Kentucky defensively, from a metric standpoint, look pretty good, allowing just shade more than 5 yards per play. Opposing offenses are gaining just 36% of available yards. Obviously, some of that's inflated by a soft out-of-conference strength of schedule. They've held opponents to quick possessions. Only 32% of drives against them this year have gained 2+ first downs. But in steps Tennessee, a completely different animal than taking on a Mississippi State, a South Carolina, or some of the other non-conference foes they've played. As you begin to look at this Tennessee offense matched up against the Kentucky defense, is there something you want to see if the Wildcats are going to have the ability to achieve some success and keep it inside this double-digit price?
Can Kentucky get pressure on Hendon Hooker? Because as decent as their stats look against, obviously, competition that is far inferior to what they're going to see offensively from Tennessee on Saturday night, Kentucky has not been able to get pressure. Only 9 sacks so far this year. And Payne talked about, the offensive line struggling, not only in the run game earlier in the season, but that they've also had a sack problem on the offense side of the ball. So when you have a team that, can't protect the quarterback, and then on the other side, the matchup specifically here, can't get after the quarterback, and you have a team with a negative 16 sack differential for the season, I'm not very optimistic about Kentucky's chances here. You hit the nail on the head, Todd, talking about defending Mississippi State and Mike Leach's offense. Entirely different animal than Tennessee, just with Tennessee's offensive balance that they can throw at you, and on top of it having a mobile quarterback, unlike Mississippi State. So metrics look good. I'll also throw some caveats in there. Kentucky played a backup quarterback against Northern Illinois. They struggled in the first half against Miami of Ohio in the opener. Then they got a backup. They injured the starter, and then the backup in the second half they had more success with. An FCS team they played. So the question mark I have is just a huge step up in competition, and I just question Kentucky's ability to get after Hendon Hooker.
It makes a ton of sense. Now, the one good thing, I guess, if you're Kentucky trying to find a silver lining, they at least had to deal with a bit of pace and tempo, albeit a very different-looking offense in Ole Miss. On the road, we know the Rebels like to run the ball first and foremost compared to Tennessee. And Payne, I don't want to oversimplify what they may have to do defensively, but you just go in with a light box, go, hey, if Tennessee, you're going to beat us, we're going to make you put together 8 to 10 plays. We're going to try and bend but don't break. You get into the red zone, we'll keep you to 3s instead of 7s. Because for Tennessee, we've seen the emergence of Jalen Hyatt. I mean, 9 touchdowns the last 3 games, 160-plus receiving yards in 3 out of 5 games. And, it just so happens, waiting in the wings, that Cedric Tillman could be back for this game, even if he happens to be on a limited snap count.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so, Tennessee's offense just humming right now. And obviously they're the best offense in the country, even schedule adjusted. They just don't let you breathe. I mean, they're 5th in plays per minute. So you have this, uber efficient offense that's also hyper aggressive, and they just wear you down mentally and physically. And Brad hit on it. Kentucky hasn't shown an ability to get pressure. And you look at some of the defensive metrics, and this is why watching some of these games are very important. I typically hate watching stuff, but
I know you remind me every Saturday. Don't worry about it. I know.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of forced myself to watch these games just because we have all the data in the world, but sometimes it doesn't mesh. And Brad really hinted at this. Kentucky right now is supposedly 6th in scheduled defensive efficiency, right? 12th in opponent adjusted yards per play. I just don't know if it unfolds that way in this game. And Kentucky has to at least provide some resistance on this side of the ball and make Tennessee earn their points, to your point, and get a few stops along the way. I mean, it is nice having 2 weeks where Stoops can come up with something unique, give Hooker and company, right, a look they might not have seen or they might not have prepared for when they assess your film, right? And again, I know what the metrics say, but you look at this schedule of offenses that Kentucky's played, it just makes me so nervous. Miami, Ohio, Florida. I mean, they just don't have a passing attack. Youngstown, NIU without Rocky Lombardi, South Carolina, they can't really throw the ball. Mississippi State is more of the sideline to sideline type game. It's not very vertical, as we talked about last week. The best passing offense metrically Kentucky played is Ole Miss, and we kind of saw what that looked like last week when the Rebels finally stepped up in class. I mean, they got completely shut down the final 3 quarters against an LSU secondary, many disliked for a large portion of the season. So Stoops has to do enough to keep things in front and slow it down. And I've kind of seen what's going on around on social media among some of the college football guys and about slowing Hendon Hooker's legs down. And sure, right, it helps having played Richardson and Dart, who are mobile, and it helps playing a zone-based scheme like Kentucky where your players keep their eyes forward and you can look at the quarterback. But Anthony Richardson and Dart rely on their legs. That's their better attribute as players right now. Hendon Hooker is a passer that can run, and that's the difference. Hendon Hooker can consistently throw the ball. And in this game last year on the road, Hooker contributed 19 predicted points added via the pass. He's a much better player this season. He's a much better reading defenses. He can look defenses off and throw the other way. What's interesting here, and give Stoops some credit, when we broke down Kentucky in the preseason, and we listened to quotes from coaches, their concern was in the secondary. They were looking to add some help through the portal. Didn't get as much as they would have liked. They were trying to add a late piece or two to the mix. And while Kentucky's been good metrically defending the pass, they haven't played any good passing offenses, as we've indicated. They're still surrendering 7.5 air yards per pass attempt, barely inside the top 100 there. Kentucky's given up explosive passes. And now you get a guy like Jalen Hyatt, who's averaging 3.4 receiving yards per team play. That's top 5 among Power 5 receivers. And you hinted at this. A very nice, subtle little drop there, that it's our belief that Cedric Tillman will be out there for a few snaps this week.
Yeah, I think he can definitely change the offense. And the one thing, too, I saw some of that social media buzz as well. Keep in mind that Anthony Richardson was kept in check. He was hit on the knee in the first quarter against Kentucky and was confined to being a pocket passer. So Hendon Hooker will have a little bit more mobility. If I'm Coach Stoops on the Kentucky sidelines, the first call I'm making to devise a defensive game plan is to my brother Mike to figure out what it was like going up against Josh Heupel every day in practice when Heupel was a member of the OU football program, figuring out if there are some weaknesses to be exploited, knowing the personnel may not necessarily be the same. For the Big Ten,
Todd, one thing you said going back, and we don't have to do too much on this one, but you did hint at one thing on the opposite side of the ball before we close that out, in that Kentucky's offense playing this keep away style, having to get 7 instead of 3. The one thing that's also been the saving grace for the Vols is their top 15 in points allowed per quality possession. So, yes, they've given up a ton of quality possessions because they're not a great defense, but when they get down there, opposing offenses get down there, they've really held them in check. And for what we're seeing with Kentucky offensively, again, the ground game hasn't been as efficient, so they haven't been great turning those green and red zone trips into 7. So that's another thing here that makes me a little bit nervous. Now, I know we got to 13, and then we saw some buyback yesterday. Chris is at 11.5, so clearly some sharp sentiment on Kentucky, but really there's one book that's quite sharp that's still hanging 13, and no one's taken it yet, which is a little bit disturbing to me if you like the Kentucky side.
Yeah, one thing I will say, when you talk about those red zone possessions and needing to get 7, look for Will Levis to add an element potentially with his legs that's not always on full display if Kentucky wants to try and provide a different wrinkle for this game. But so many fascinating components. There's a reason that, in my opinion, this will be the most interesting game of the day, because even as we get into late October and these teams have played 6-7 games, there is always that water meeting its level contest, and maybe it comes Saturday night for both UK and UT. Ohio State and Penn State, though, will kick things off early in Happy Valley, and while normally this game is the whiteout, being the big noon kickoff, Penn State elected to use that little wrinkle last Saturday night against Minnesota, and of course it paid dividends with the Nittany Lions absolutely boat racing PJ Fleck and company. When you look at where this number is, Ohio State a 15.5-point road favorite, total in the game 61. Ryan Day 29-1 versus conference opponents. His lone loss as head coach of Ohio State came last year against the Michigan Wolverines in the regular season finale. The longest streak of 45-plus points in a game in school history, and the longest streak of 28-plus point victories in school history ongoing for Ohio State right now. When you look at the Buckeyes, they've won 5 straight and 9 of the last 10 games versus Penn State. The lone loss coming in 2016 as a 19-point road favorite. The current winning streak is the longest by either program in series history. Penn State, meanwhile, has lost 7 straight since the upset of Ohio State when they step up in class. Now, the silver lining, if you're a Penn State fan, despite being just 1-7 the last 8 games against the Buckeyes, under James Franklin, Penn State is 6-2 against the spread, and in this business, that's the only thing that matters to us, having lost only one of those games by 14-plus points. Brad, if Penn State is going to have some level of success and push Ohio State deep into the fourth quarter, do you have more confidence in their ability to do so on the offensive side, or will it be because this could be a jolt to the Buckeyes' passing offense, knowing how talented this Penn State secondary can be, at least at the defensive back 1 and 2 positions?
That's a really good question. And I have to question the ability for Penn State to have success in either. I would say Penn State defensively, but then in the back of my mind, I see Michigan getting another 40 or 50-yard explosive run play, and I could just see a now healthy Travion Henderson running through that secondary. It doesn't matter about Ohio State's pass offense. So I'm a little bit, after seeing Sean Clifford play college football for the last 10 years, I think I know what I got from him, and I question the ability for him to have consistent success. So I would say I'm a little bit more optimistic because of what that group that you mentioned, Penn State's secondary being by far the best secondary, in my opinion, that Ohio State's seen so far this season.
Yeah, I mean, Joey Porter putting up huge numbers, and when you look at Pro Football Focus metrics, he's not even the top-rated defensive back for Penn State so far. I know the yardage totals they've allowed don't blow anybody away, but they do have some difference makers on the outside. Obviously, some interesting ties between these two programs, knowing that Mike Yurcich, the Penn State offensive coordinator, was a major part of Ryan Day's recruitment of C.J. Stroud. Ryan Day kind of joked during the course of the week, Payne, that he was fine for missing media obligations, but he think it turned out quite all right, given the quarterback they have under center, when you see that C.J. Stroud is now the odds-on favorite to win the Heisman Trophy. If you're Penn State defensively, how do you go about trying to at least slow down Ohio State's offense, knowing that shutting them down is something that's absolutely impossible with all the difference makers they have, both in the ground game that Brad mentioned and some of the receivers we talked about as we review the national rankings on why Ohio State's number one in the country?
This game has my brain in a pretzel, and I'll just be honest. And I think that's the interesting component. You did say off the top, right, how like James Franklin's had really good success since he's arrived at Penn State against Ohio State. He's only lost one game against Ohio State by the margin this spread indicates. So to me, the market's speaking here, right? It's telling us something. My number doesn't get here. I still haven't bet Penn State yet. And this will probably sound nutty to some based on rankings and being undefeated. And who knows if Ohio State will ever truly get tested on this side of the ball. But it doesn't look perfect to me for Ohio State offensively. Like when I watch them play, it's just not this fine-tuned machine that's humming. Smith-Njigba, which you talked about at the top, can't seem to get healthy. He's supposedly going to be on a limited snap count this week. And when you watch him play, right, he just continues to come up lame, and he's clearly not 100%. But you mentioned at the very top of the show that they've been tested once. And I think they've been tested twice, right? You look at the opener against Notre Dame. Ohio State didn't have answers to combat that unfamiliar look. They averaged 5.7 yards per play against Notre Dame, 11% explosive play rate, 1.9 points per drive. O-line couldn't get push, just 1.7 yards before first contact that week one game against Notre Dame. And then last week, kind of all hinted at it, right? And I'm sure people get enamored with the scoreboard and see 54 against a great Iowa defense and think it was just this lights-out offensive performance. Multiple scores were set up by Jim Knowles' defense. Ohio State, their starting field position, I know Brad hinted at this, right, was the 45-yard line. Ohio State wasn't explosive offensively. Their O-line didn't create push again, just 1.5 yards before first contact. The running backs, which we think are potentially the best duo in the country, they're typically elusive and dynamic, 0.7 yards per rush after contact against Iowa. C.J. Stroud and the receiver group struggled mightily to separate and beat man coverage if you look at some of those splits. And again, when Smith-Njigba goes down and Harrison suddenly becomes the one, has not shown the consistent ability to beat man. So to me, we're nitpicking here. We see what the metrics indicate. We see where they're ranked in terms of schedule-adjusted efficiency, but it just doesn't look perfect. And that's kind of the perception, that this offense is just completely humming and they have all this talent. The problem here is in this matchup, I have questions about Penn State's defense, and I think those questions are a little bit more extreme. On the season, Penn State's faced a schedule of offenses that are averaging out to be 65th in schedule-adjusted offensive efficiency. Against Auburn, though, you played a quarterback that's been benched. Last week against Minnesota in a whiteout game, you got Minnesota without its quarterback and leading receiver. So you have to make some manual tweaks to Penn State's schedule in terms of who they've faced defensively. The one top 30 offense Penn State has played is what Brad referenced in Michigan. Just took them to the woodshed. I mean, Penn State was bullied in the trenches. I am not sure we're going to see a top 25 matchup again this season where a team gives up 5.2 yards per rush before first contact. I mean, Michigan was just drumming them. 54% of plays against Penn State's defense were successful. Penn State didn't force a single 3-and-out all game. On average, right, Michigan, who's on the fringe of being a top 10 offense, averaged more than 56 yards per drive against Penn State. Now you get metrically what's the second best offense in the country in Ohio State. I don't know how many stops Penn State's going to get here. And that's ultimately why I have not gotten to the window with a ticket here, even though my number is... I'm going to say substantially shorter.
Yeah, I mean, we say all the time in college football, if you can run the football on the road and play defense, that's obviously the recipe for success, especially when you're going into hostile territory. Ohio State coaches did mention that their roster relatively young at some spots, haven't played necessarily in this kind of environment, but at the same time, it's an early game with a noon Eastern kickoff, and Ohio State can pack their lunch pails on the defensive side because we're starting to see that group round into form under Jim Knowles' leadership. They've allowed just 6 first-half touchdowns on 46 opposing drives so far this season. They forced 17 3-and-outs. And when you look at some of the veteran leadership, I mean, there can't be enough effuse praise heaped on a guy like Tanner McAllister, who transferred over from Oklahoma State. He kind of serves as the quarterback of that defense, gets everybody lined up. And Brad, you mentioned Sean Clifford and how long he's been there. There's a reason that he is more of a field general than he has a higher ceiling than what a quarterback like Drew Allar can bring to the table. But if you're Ohio State, you sell out, you stop the run, you take Nick Singleton out of the mix. I'm not sure Sean Clifford and this high-flying Penn State passing attack, even in their own building, really puts a whole lot of fear into you come Saturday afternoon.
Completely agree with that. I mean, that has to be the game plan for Ohio State. If the Penn State offense is going to have success against us, it has to be Sean Clifford playing the game of his life, because you mentioned the Ohio State secondary, much improved. I mean, the entire defense is much improved under Jim Knowles. I mean, this is a defense allowing 133 yards per game less than what it did last year. I know it's going to be ultimately determined by what they do against Michigan and in the playoffs, but right now Jim Knowles looks like the best hire of the offseason, at least among the national title contending teams. So, and then I question Penn State. Look, Singleton and the other freshmen have looked good so far, but when you start breaking it down and comparing to what they did non-conference versus conference, they've been less effective in conference play. Obviously playing from a little bit behind against Michigan, but they just couldn't do anything offensively. We mentioned the defense not having any success. The offense couldn't do anything. It was actually a misleading score, the fact that they lost by only 24 in that game. So I question whether Penn State, even with those talented freshmen, can have success against this Ohio State rush defense. With that being said, because, I mean, there's always two sides to a handicap, I'm not sure that Ohio State's defense, as much improved as they've been, you start looking at who they faced. Notre Dame offensively, I would say particularly at the quarterback position, very limited. Iowa last week, limited at the quarterback position. I'm not a big fan of Graham Mertz in Wisconsin. And then you're getting to some of the weaker teams that they faced so far this year. So as bad, as average and mediocre as Sean Clifford is, I would take Sean Clifford over those 3 quarterbacks of those 3 teams that they've faced so far this year.
Yeah, I mean, it may be Michigan State, the most explosive offense that Ohio State has had a matchup with on the defensive side, especially on the road in East Lansing. And when you look at Penn State's difference makers, you know, you highlighted the running backs, Brad, at receiver. Mitchell Tinsley and Parker Washington are nice pieces, but clearly this offense lacks that big play potential that they had in Jahan Dotson. Payne, if you're sitting in that offensive coordinator room for Penn State trying to devise a game plan, how do you go about trying to attack the Scarlet and Gray and keeping this game competitive, staying within that 2-touchdown tariff?
Yeah, I think you have to test that secondary early on just to see if it's for real. I think you are trying to find your footing when you're looking at this particular side of the matchup, because as you guys have both indicated, like, schedule is really important. We obviously all loved the Jim Knowles hire in the moment. I do think the progress took shape quicker, and it's far more pronounced than we might have envisioned 7 games into year 1. Some of it could be the schedule. I get it, right, that the schedule's not good. Ohio State's played offenses on average that are 74th in schedule-adjusted efficiency right now. But how they've played those offenses is important. And on average, Penn State's offense would certainly classify as a step up for sure. They're 40th. But sometimes, you know, finding that one data point can be more telling than multiple data points in these specific situations, right? Finding how these teams have played when they have stepped up in weight class. Penn State's offense is in the identical weight class as Michigan State's offense in overall schedule-adjusted efficiency. And that was also a road game for Ohio State's defense. Scoreboard doesn't necessarily indicate what truly transpired there. You see 20 points for Michigan State scored, and you're like, not terrible. 7 of the 20 points scored were defensively for Sparty. 7 points were in garbage time in the fourth quarter with 5 minutes to go, down 36. For the first 54 minutes of that game, Michigan State put together one scoring drive. Ohio State forced Sparty to go 3 and out on 55% of their possessions. Michigan State only averaged 21 yards per drive. You look at Jim Knowles' front seven, they're completely dominant. I mean, Sparty averaged negative 1.2 yards per rush before first contact, 5.1 yards per pass attempt. Overall, just a 33% success rate on the day for Sparty there. So let's see what Penn State does here, what version of Sean Clifford we get this week. It's always interesting to see how quickly college football fans and analysts flip-flop. I mean, people were calling for Drew Lar to take over after Sean Clifford was 17 for 39 in back-to-back games against Northwestern Michigan, and suddenly Clifford plays his best game of the season against Minnesota, actually had his best QBR in a game he's finished since the opener against Indiana in 2020, and suddenly all the problems are fixed. So that's what's interesting to me here, right? You know, the one time Clifford and Penn State's offenses played a defense on Ohio State's level, Brad mentioned it, right? They were embarrassed against Michigan. Clifford averaged 4.8 yards per pass attempt. Just 9% offensive plays were explosive against Michigan. So this is the thing that I'm just struggling with because I don't see a matchup advantage anywhere in this game for Penn State, but my number isn't anywhere close to 16.
All about the secret sauce. Arriving at the X's and O's on the football field, trying to figure out if the number offers value one way or another, and reading
Brad,
the market.
Brad, what did you make this game?
Pure power rating is 15. Last week, certain books are putting look-ahead lines up. I bet Ohio State 11, so I'm not surprised by the number. It is an interesting handicap in that series history from James Franklin, as bad as he is against Michigan, for some reason he plays Ohio State tough each and every year. So I mean, there's that pulling at me a little bit, that the number seems high compared to what we've seen the last 5-6 years, but I can't get there on Penn State. I would need 17 to play back a little bit on Penn State.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask you. If you got 17, You'd play the middle.
Yeah, a little bit of a class difference emerging there, and we'll keep tabs on where the market goes. As you look at the price, pretty much opened in this range, did have one prominent offshore as high as 16.5, but for the most part, sitting in no man's land to see where professional bettors may push this closer to Saturday. As always, you can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. You can also follow Brad Powers at BradPower7, but most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. From Big Ten country, we head to the ACC, or at least the de facto ACC matchup in central New York, where the Syracuse Orange will welcome in the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. And at Syracuse, a 2.5-point favorite in the game. Total on this thing sits at 48.5. The Irish record of 4-3 is the worst through 7 games since 2016. This will mark the Irish's first trip to the Dome since 2003, when Brady Quinn was the team's starting quarterback. Meanwhile, on the Syracuse side, 6 home wins for the Orange would mark first time since 2018 they were able to accomplish this feat. A win here would mark the program's first 7-1 start since 1992. They haven't run the table in their non-conference matchups going all the way back to 1991. However, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish have owned the ACC. 20-1 the last 21 games versus ACC opponents. They've gone 12-9 against the spread during that stretch. The last loss versus an ACC team came in the ACC Conference Championship against Clemson back in 2020. 25 straight regular season wins over the ACC, 12 straight road games in that particular span. Brad, we know you are the king of Notre Dame Fighting Irish football. You've forgotten more about this program than Payne and I will ever know. When you begin to look at this matchup and try and break down the X's and O's, is it as simple and straightforward as Notre Dame, if they're able to run the football, they're going to have success? If they can't, Syracuse can bounce back from a gut-wrenching defeat at Clemson last Saturday.
I honestly think it could be that simple in that regard. And a little, pull behind the curtain. And I'm very negative. Even though I'm a fan, I am very pessimistic about Notre Dame. I don't care how many wins that they have in a certain particular season. I'm always looking through what is their faults, and it's always Chicken Little, sky is falling with them. With that being said, I expected to be betting NotreAme in this game. I went into Sunday morning thinking if I can get a 3.5 on Notre Dame, that's where my money is. I was stunned that Notre Dame open favorite. So, I bet numbers, not teams. Took Syracuse. With that being said, I do see a pathway to success for Notre Dame. And you mentioned it, Todd. It is through the ground game, which is improving. It's the one unit that is getting better for Notre Dame. They got healthier on the offensive line. Keep in mind their captain, Jarrett Patterson, missed the Ohio State game. He's position changed from center to left guard. They have a couple of true sophomore offensive tackles starting for him. And then they had a brand new offensive line coach that is, technically can be a little bit more complicated than what they've had the last 4 or 5 years. So there is a pathway here because Syracuse on the defensive side of the ball, banged up, lost several starters out for the year. They had some other guys get banged up last week. And I'll say this, a lot of people are going to complain and stuff about the calls that might have went against Syracuse. I still think it was a misleading game. I mean, there were +3 in turnovers, the 90-yard fumble return touchdown. I mean, that's a 10 to 14 point swing in that regard. So I'm not sure. I still have my question marks about how really good Syracuse is offensively and defensively.
And when you look at Syracuse last week, one of the more bizarre storylines that developed, Sean Tucker, the nation's 4th leading rusher, carried the ball just 5 times. It clearly took umbrage with that as he went to social media about how he wanted to be more involved in the game plan. You always wonder what kind of ripple effect that'll have there. When you look at Syracuse, they allowed 17 unanswered points to back up Cade Klubnik. Garrett Schrader accounted for 238 of Syracuse's 291 yards. But on the other side, Syracuse allowed Clemson to run the football and run the football exceptionally well. 293 yards Clemson churned out on the ground, a career-high 172 yards rushing for Will Shipley. Payne, when you look at some of the metrics in that particular department, is there reason for optimism that Notre Dame can have success both hitting on explosive plays and being able to grind out yards down to down against the Syracuse defensive front for some of the concerns that Brad just raised?
Yeah, let's get to that in a minute. I think the number here is really interesting because Brad said he bet Syracuse early on. But yesterday when we got to Notre Dame +3, maybe not specific to Brad, but the sentiment seemed to change at that number. And, we discussed coaching and matchups and styles. And within those things, you are betting on teams, but that team has an accompanying price attached, and ultimately that's the most important thing, right? So the conversation is different from Notre Dame -2 than Notre Dame +3. And so it's just going to be one of those games where, I try to do my best informationally well in advance to say, I wouldn't be shocked if there's a battle here. And, I don't know how good Notre Dame is. Quarterback game plans leave much to be desired, and Brad, again, knows the Irish inside and out, but I, like Brad, was not impressed with Syracuse last week. And I saw the same scoreboard everyone else did. And kudos to Robert and I and Dino Babers for coming up with a fantastic script and game plan. But once that wore off, Syracuse did zip. Syracuse had nearly 14 points in turnover luck. Clemson had 4 turnovers. They were expected to have a shade less than 1.5. So a massive variant shift there to the negative for Clemson. Syracuse also won the explosive play battle by more than 10%. The deck was stacked in Syracuse's favor with those two elements of turnover luck and winning the explosive play battle. They still lost the game. And there were some interesting comments from Dino Babers leading up to the Clemson game when he was asked about the 6-0 start and a potential conference title. And Babers' response was, I'm happy we're bowl eligible. That says a lot to me when you start to think about what he believes his team is and what the schedule is going forward. Getting to the key matchup, I think you both hit this perfectly, and it's Notre Dame's ability to run the ball and not have Drew Pine forced to throw in known situations. We have seen regression from Pine back-to-back weeks against UNLV and Stanford, where he's got a combined QBR of 33. And it's a little bit head-scratching because it looked like he made some great steps forward against BYU and North Carolina, where he had a QBR combined in the high 80s in those two games. And obviously, BYU's defensively is not what we thought it could be, and we know what North Carolina is defensively, but still, right? I mean, you're thinking UNLV and Stanford, like, we're going to see the same Drew Pine that we've saw back-to-back weeks. We also know Syracuse defensive coordinator Tony White presents some challenging looks to disguise things pre and post snap. Brad hinted at some of the injuries defensively for Syracuse, and one of their key cogs in the secondary is certainly banged up. But to Brad's point again, right, Notre Dame's offensive line has really started getting some push. And on the season, after even a slow start, They're now 17th in adjusted line yards. Only 12% of runs have been stuffed at or behind the line of scrimmage. That's a top 10 rate. So that's a good sign that Drew Pine's going to be able to throw comfortably if because there's not a lot of negative plays that are unfolding on early downs. And we talked about this last week, right? About how Syracuse plays this light box with their 3-3-5 stack, and it's why they're 110th in EPA per rush allowed. And even though DJU and Cade Klubnik couldn't hit the broadside of a barn and combined literally for 1.6 adjusted net yards per pass attempt. So zero threat of Clemson moving it through the air last week. Clemson was still above the national average in both yards before first contact per rush and yards after contact per rush. So that kind of just further depicts Syracuse issues stopping the run when they're stepping up in class a little bit, something they hadn't done until last week, really. Now, Notre Dame gets zero explosiveness out of their run game, but down to down, the Irish are quite good, 48% rushing success rate. And that's the reason Notre Dame this season hasn't faced a lot of known passing situations. Just 26% of offensive snaps have been known passing downs. That's a top 10 rate. So huge positive for Dame there. And again, like the scoreboard will only slay. Clemson scored 24 points. But they gained 52% of the available yards last week against this Syracuse defense. This very much feels like a game that we're all in a line with, that whoever can run the ball is probably going to win it and cover it, because both of these quarterbacks in known passing situations could lead to some turnovers and variance.
Brad, one last thing I have for you on the Notre Dame ground game. We saw Logan Diggs take the lion's share of touches last week. I know the Irish have a trio of running backs now with 70-plus touches. Suffice to say that Diggs is their best option going forward at RB1, given some of the fumbling concerns we've seen from Audric Estime, and that Chris Tyree is a little bit more versatile in some other aspects of things.
Couldn't agree more. Logan Diggs will be, at this time, he will be running back one. I mean, Estime just obviously runs hard, gives him a different look, a bruiser, a bigger back. But, I mean, when you put the ball on the ground several times, 3 times in 4 games, I mean, I actually expect his carries to lessen. And Diggs, as we saw specifically in those final 2-3 drives in the second half, was just basically a bell cow. They just, basically turned it around and handed it to him. And he was up to the challenge. And keep in mind, he was also slow to start. He had an injury that limited him at the start of the season. So there's a lot of guys, at least when it comes to Notre Dame's rush offense, that have gotten healthier. And that's a big reason why that's the one thing that they can hang on as a football team here.
Yeah, pretty wild when you look at Notre Dame through the first 7 games, that their entire season will get defined by what they do going forward. This game obviously significantly bigger now than we anticipated coming into the year, going up into the Dome to take on Syracuse. You got a game with USC, a game with Clemson. So Marcus Freeman is going to create that level of optimism. I think Notre Dame has to strive to maybe go 4-1, a best case scenario, 3-2, absolute worst case, to feel this season wasn't a complete loss. Payne, this is the game where you get to take a water break. You get to go to the bathroom and do what you want. So Brad and I get to talk about the little guys in college football that I know you don't want to pay any attention to because they don't reside in a Power 5 conference. And this week, the non-Powers 5 game takes us to Orlando, where UCF will welcome in perennial power in the American Athletic Conference, Cincinnati. And when you look at this game, the number is all over the place. Some shops, UCF -1. Other shops have Cincinnati a 1-point favorite. Last year, UCF was drummed by the Cincinnati Bearcats, 56-21. The Bearcats covered as a 21.5 home point favorite. Since he's now won 3 straight versus UCF. UCF's last win versus Cincinnati came back in 2018, a 38-13 victory, where UCF went on to finish 12-1 and 11th in the final AP poll. When you look at what Luke Fickell's been able to accomplish, Cincinnati's won 38 straight games versus unranked teams. It's now the longest active streak in the FBS. They've won 19 consecutive games versus AAC opponents, tied for the longest conference win streak in AAC history, with what UCF was able to accomplish in 2017 to 2019. If you're looking for symmetry, well, Cincinnati's ended UCF's 19-game AAC win streak back in 2019. Brad, you brought up an interesting point in this game when we talked a little bit off air about how Cincinnati has gone out there. They're racking up wins, but they've allowed inferior foes to hang around. Now, I don't say that because of the back door that SMU came bursting through last week as a 3-point underdog, with the Mustangs not being able to do anything until the final 2 drives. But even against teams like USF, and Tulsa, this Bearcat defense hasn't shown that lockdown potential, that killer instinct that we've grown accustomed to, and in steps arguably one of the most explosive offenses that they'll face in league play this year.
You're right. So Obviously there's 131 teams at the FBS level, and believe it or not, I also power 8 FCS teams. But with that being said, Cincinnati's like one of the very few handful of teams that I've almost seen every single play of all their games so far this season. Why? I've been involved on every single Cincinnati game. And it hasn't been anti-Cincinnati. In fact, even last week, I bet on Cincinnati, a game that, I thought they should have closed out. But the reasons that I'm against them in this game is just something's just not right with this team. You mentioned, not having killer instinct on the defensive side of the ball. Offensively, they've been trying to meander their way around a few injuries. Ben Bryant was in concussion protocol, the quarterback. They've been missing their deep threat at wide receiver and Tyler Scott. He is expected possibly back this week. But defensively, mobile quarterbacks, they've struggled against. Arkansas and USF were able to get some ground games. And I think, shockingly for this Cincinnati team, they're not very disciplined. Dead last in the country in penalties and penalty yardage. And when you talk about not being able to close down teams, some of it has to do with that. But I also think that, unlike the SMUs, the USFs of the world, the Tulsas of the world, if you're committing a bunch of penalties, sure, maybe you don't cover a point spread. In this particular case, if you're doing that on Saturday afternoon and you're not buttoned up on the road and you have 10, 12 penalties like they did last week, forget covering a spread. You're losing the game outright in a game that's basically a pick-em here. And I also think on the UCF side of things, probably a little bit, people are a little bit down on them considering the final score last week wasn't good at all. I mean, they lost by 21 against East Carolina. I would say misleading, though, -4 in turnovers. And also, Gus Malzahn, a type of coach, going back to the Auburn games, capable of beating Alabama one week and turn around and losing to Mississippi State. So, I think this is being a big game. This is more in his wheelhouse. And speaking of house, Bounce House will be rocking. Of all the Group of 5 home atmospheres this entire season, this will probably be the best one, the best and most hostile environment for a G5 school.
Brad, you mentioned watching Cincinnati and the majority of their plays and games all season long. I haven't spent nearly as much attention on them, but the one thing that I've been able to take away when I do watch them, it feels like this offense goes through lulls. Yep. They'll put together 2 or 3 drives where they look like the greatest thing since sliced bread, and then 3 or 4 series in a row, whether they lose interest, whether it's their own shooting themselves in the foot with some of those penalties you mentioned, they just go through these stretches that's not just 1 or 2 drives where you go, what's going on here? You can find that separation. You can be able to distance yourself. And I think, to your point, going into this kind of environment, you can't afford to have those lapses in concentration or whatever it is, because UCF can score in a heartbeat. And with a player as dynamic as John Reese Plumlee under center, they can hit the big play. They'll take advantage if there's anything close to a defensive breakdown.
You're right. And it's just not one game we're pointing towards. It's every single game Cincinnati has inconsistencies in their play. Even going back to the opener against Arkansas, inconsistencies in the red zone pretty much cost Payne and myself and a lot of other people that bet Cincinnati in that game. Probably were the right side. They could have easily won the game outright, but again, inefficiencies every single game. And whether it's penalties, missed assignments, lack of maybe a leadership, you're missing a 4-year starter at quarterback in Desmond Ritter. I don't know what it is, but just something, even though they've been winning games, even though they're ranked now number 20 in the country, there's just something, they're not as good as each of the last 2 years, not even close to the last 2 years.
Payne, assuming you've had a chance to refill your water jug, grab a little snack for a halftime break, maybe some orange slices or anything along those lines, is there anything you'd like to add to this particular handicap before we move back to Power 5 conference football?
Got to tell you, I take offense to that because Boise State was my favorite bet last week. So I am a guy who navigates outside of the big boy schools, although I do love talent. And you were heaping praise upon a very proficient base stealer at Ole Miss.
He was a hell of a college
ball
ball player until he decided to make the full-scale commitment. The problem for UCF offensively, he looks like a baseball player throwing the forward pass for stretches during football games.
I do think what's interesting here, just matchup-wise, is on that side of the ball, UCF has been fantastic running the ball. I mean, that's been their strength. They're top 20 in EPA per rush. That's shockingly where Cincinnati's been a little deficient. They've been able to be moved around in the trenches. On the other side of the ball, it's going to be Cincinnati having to rely on their pass game because UCF's been a little bit more stout in the trenches defensively. So you're looking at some of the matchups within this game along with the ancillary elements that Brad mentioned, right? This is going to be a packed house. You probably have to give a little bit more home field advantage for UCF than you regularly would on a normal week. And so I do see some value here. Some of the matchups make sense. Haven't bet it this week, right? Haven't bet this game. Obviously, like Boise was the match between us last week, and I think every time we've matched, like just take that to the bank. I still have to do a little more work here, but I certainly lean UCF.
Yeah, that Boise game should have been even easier than it was if Boise decided they wanted to score in the second half or didn't kick 37 field goals, but I'm never going to complain whatsoever when we can get an underdog
with a little EPL match.
Yeah, an underdog to win outright with Boise taking advantage of that thin air in Colorado Springs. All right, back to the Big 12 we go for a showdown in Manhattan, Kansas against the team that's not going to be given any Christmas cards, any fruit baskets, or anything anytime soon for our loyal listenership because Kansas State led us slightly astray, squandering a 28-10 lead against TCU last Saturday. Here we are with Kansas State, a modest 1.5-point home favorite as they'll welcome in Oklahoma State. Total on the game 56. And I'll set this game up, guys, before we go in a different direction, just talking about a little bit of series history and what we can expect from these two teams. When you look at Oklahoma State, they've been dynamic at the betting window. 7-0 against the spread the last 7 road games they've played in conference. When you look at how they've performed, an FBS best 14-2 against the spread the last 16 times that Mike Gundy's teams have been installed as an underdog. They've gone 3-0 against the spread this year in that role. Meanwhile, Chris Kleiman 0-3 in his career as head coach at Kansas State against these very same Cowpokes. When you look at Oklahoma State, started the year undefeated in conference. Their games are averaging nearly 73 points per contest. And when you look at Oklahoma State, they typically step up in class when the opportunity presents itself. 8-1-1 against the spread the last 10 games versus AP-ranked teams. 3-0 against AP-ranked teams this season. Winning at Baylor, winning outright last week against Texas. I mean, they've gone out there and they've exceeded odds makers' expectations. I'm not shy in saying that Oklahoma State has baffled me maybe more than any team in a Power 5 conference over the last couple of years, not named Wisconsin, because when I think they're going to let up, they find a different gear, they erase deficits, and it's a credit to what they've done. Maybe Mike Gundy's best coaching job thus far, knowing he doesn't have the weapons here. But guys, I can put all of that out there. For me, this game isn't even necessarily about the number, which Brad will get to you in a second on. It's all about information as much as anything else. But in terms of a point spread, what did you use as your baseline to start before we get into all the question marks we have about Kansas State and some of their difference makers, specifically on the offensive side?
Tough one, obviously, because we're dealing with a lot of moving factors here. And we'll start with Kansas State side. I mean, Adrian Martinez, is he going to play or not? Did not practice earlier this week. My guess is he will not play. As inconsistent as he's been in his career, I mean, he had a couple of his best performances of his entire career earlier this year against Oklahoma and Texas Tech. So I do think Will Howard, even though he's got a lot of experience for a backup, 10 career starts, he's at least a couple point downgrade. So right now, I think Will Howard will get the start. So that was a couple point downgrade there. So with that being said, I made it with that. Kansas State won. But then we're also dealing with a lot of injuries on the Oklahoma State defensive side of the ball. And then you also have to anticipate market moves. I'm not surprised Kansas State's been taking a lot of money this week, even with a questionable status for Martinez. Why? If there's one team in college football that has been played against week after week, Oklahoma State. It doesn't matter that these people like to lose money fading them, but I mean, last week we saw a ton of money, and I get it. I mean, you look at not only the injury front, a lot of guys were announced out right prior to the Texas game. Obviously, Spencer Sanders, well publicized, not 100%. And then metrically, just simple metrics, yards per play margin, yards per game margin. I mean, Oklahoma State's number 73, number 69. I mean, metrically, it says even when they're playing, factor in the schedule, it's a team that should not only have one loss on the season. So with all that being said, I have not gotten in the window yet on this one. I think Kansas State's the right side, but I call it flashbacks to what happened last week. I didn't race to the window to bet the Wildcats this week.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma State is a team that's been bet against as often in college football over the last season or, the last couple of years, as we've seen this year in the National Football League with the Washington Commanders being a bet on side where the metrics don't always line up. And we can get into the Tennessee Titans. That's a completely different discussion for a different day in the NFL. But Payne, when you look at a game like this, and Adrian Martinez, clearly a difference maker, Will Howard filled in admirably, but to Brad's point, we have enough of a sample size on Will Howard during his career that we know he's not going to come in and wow everybody. He's not going to Wally Pip a healthy Adrian Martinez when he's a guy that's 3-7 career record, 1-2 in 3 starts last season, and 2-5 in the 7 starts he had back in 2020, contributing less than 175 total yards per game and a 14-10 touchdown interception ratio. I would have loved him to be able to hit a wide open receiver and make a 10-point game, a 3-point margin against TCU to give us a puncher's chance last week. But at the same time, when you go about this, though that wasn't the only injury that came up in Chris Kleiman's press conference on Monday. He talked about some difference makers on the defensive side that are nicked up, and also said that Deuce Vaughn might not be capable of taking on a full workload this week.
You keep bringing up last week's game. And
this is a safe space,
sure
and it's a cathartic experience
the audience
that I want to try and get off my chest. Because once we're done with this show, I can officially put that in the rearview mirror.
I do love our loyal listeners, but there's a handful of folks that don't understand variance, and they don't give you credit for, picking a game that you took a dog that was up 18 points and was the dead right side, and then a third-string quarterback made an appearance. They don't put those two things together, and they come out from their anonymous accounts and troll us. So I appreciate you continuing to ignite that fire.
Anytime a Rubley, whether it's his father that took snaps in the National Football League or now his son playing in college, goes out there, probably not a direct correlation to being able to cash tickets.
To your point, I listened to Chris Kleinman's interview yesterday where he said Adrian Martinez has not practiced yet this week, and he's dealing with a, quote, severely bruised knee. Is it a bruise on his knee or a bone bruise? Two wildly different things. And to your point, he also mentioned Deuce Vaughn is banged up, so you have to keep an eye on both. If it's Will Howard, I can somewhat understand the idea that there isn't much drop-off if you watched moments of last week, because he was on fire to start that game, but he's been in the program a while. There's a reason Adrian Martinez is here, right? There's a reason Will Howard has not been a starting quarterback. Now, he came in, he was 8 for 10 for 185 yards and 3 total touchdowns to start. And, 11 adjusted net yards per attempt. So he was pushing the ball down the field. And then all of a sudden, once Howard got dinged up himself and the third string quarterback entered, things went awry. And then he tried kind of coming back into that game, but Howard finished 5 for 10 with 40 yards and a pick. If you look at the larger sample sizes we have of Will Howard, in 2020, among 183 qualifying quarterbacks, Will Howard graded out QB 146. In 2021, out of 200 qualifying quarterbacks, Will Howard graded out QB 197. So
sounds like your class rank in high school.
Very possible. Very possible. It comes down to the injury game here, right? Adrian Martinez, Deuce Vaughn. There were 6 guys out, I believe, for Oklahoma State last week. Lost another guy in the middle of that game, so potentially like 7 starters that we have to keep an eye on for Oklahoma State. Generally speaking, to your point, we've had a really hard time with Oklahoma State games. I'd like to fade them, but the shenanigans seem to continue. I mean, somehow Texas had 14 penalties called on them. Oklahoma State had none, right? Texas lost about 2 touchdowns and turnover luck on top of the penalty luck. So it makes this team very hard to evaluate. If Deuce Vaughn is somewhat healthy enough to get a full load, he should have a big game. I mean, you're looking at an Oklahoma State defense that's outside the top 100 in both early down EPA and the percentage of first downs that are achieved on early downs, right? And I said last week, I didn't believe the bottom was in on the Pokes defense, and it's because of these early down metrics that are way more predictive than what's actually transpiring on other downs or within the rest of the game. I mean, 45% of the Longhorns' runs last week gained at least 5 yards. If Quinn Ewers played even a halfway competent game, I think Texas rolls. It felt like once Ewers hit a big play or two early on, he was trying to hunt the knockout punch, and it really hindered the Longhorns down-to-down efficiency, especially in the third quarter, where Texas could have sealed the game, but they had just a 21% success rate in that stanza because they were just trying to hunt the knockout punch. This, to me, again, is very much an injury report game, guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're going to want to keep tabs on and gauge how healthy Adrian Martinez is. To your point about the Chris Kleiman presser, said Adrian Martinez would have to be out there for practice on Thursday, said there are a number of veterans who it's not as important that they go through a full week of practice, but wants to know that mobility won't be restrained whatsoever as Kansas State looks at this. The one thing I will say for Oklahoma State, and I like to give credit where credit is due, I do want to say some nice things about Spencer Sanders and what he's done. A quarterback that we all had questions about and his inconsistent play over the last couple of years. So far this year, Sanders has gone above and beyond with what I would define as inferior skill position talent around him, both at the wide receiver and running back spot for Oklahoma State. 340 total yards per game, 7th in FBS, 23 total touchdowns, also tied for 7th in FBS. More importantly, the turnover bug that has plagued Sanders throughout his time in Stillwater hasn't really been much of a factor. 4 turnovers so far this season. We'll see if he's able to continue it, and maybe Oklahoma State, with a little bit of good fortune, injury luck, and a variety of other things, will be able to win that elusive conference championship that they came up one yard short of last year against the Baylor Bears. Last but certainly not least, guys, back to the ACC we go for one of the marquee games on the college football schedule annually, albeit this year it looks a little bit lopsided on paper, and just to prove to everyone that Payne isn't a Florida State homer, we'll cover a Florida Gators football game, and it's Florida, an overwhelming 3-touchdown plus underdog against the Georgia Bulldogs. 22.5 the consensus. Total in this game, 56, as they'll renew acquaintances in Jacksonville. That's been the big storyline leading up to this game, as I know Kirby Smart has kind of pushed for this to be an on-campus game that rotates. We'll see what happens once the contract is up with the city of Jacksonville going forward. The series dates back to 1904, and this will be the largest spread we've ever seen between the Gators and Bulldogs. When you look at Georgia, they're 4-1 straight up and against the number versus the Gators. Won last year 34-7. Georgia 8-1 under since the start of last year's college football playoff. So for all of the offensive accolades we heaped on them, the defense clearly is still cashing tickets to the under. When you look at the way things have gone for Florida, they've now lost 7 straight games versus AP number 1 ranked teams. Their last win coming against Alabama in the 2008 SEC championship game. Brad, when you try and assess where these two teams are, we talked about Georgia and their overall power profile. What have you done with the Gators through the first 7 games of Billy Napier's tenure?
Slight downgrade them a couple points. I mean, there's been some inconsistency, to say the least, probably starting with the quarterback. Certainly less than desirable after that opening start against Utah. I mean, in today's day and age, when you're billed as a Heisman contender and you have a negative touchdown interception ratio, that's not ideal, to say the least. And I mean, he's just basically been what he's been throughout his career, and that's a well below average passer, at least at this level of football. One thing that has surprised me, I'll spin it positive, has been the Florida ground game has been pretty good. And when you consider that they don't have much of a pass game, they have limited options as far as downfield threats at wide receiver. And when you got a ground attack averaging 6.4 yards per carry, and you're leaning on a transfer from Louisiana, from Louisiana starting on the offensive line, I would say the offense is doing okay. Defensively, when they've had to step up in competition against Utah, Tennessee, and LSU, we've seen some talent deficiencies, and I just go back to, one of the major reasons why Dan Mullen is no longer the coach. We're seeing it show up on this roster, and he wasn't, I would say, a dog on the recruiting trail. I'll just put it bluntly. And a Florida team that you normally don't have to question the talent level has come up short, and there's a reason why Georgia's laying the biggest point spread ever, at least for them in the history of this rivalry.
Look at O'Torrance catching strays from Brad on a Wednesday morning, questioning the pedigree of a former Sunbelt offensive lineman that's now anchoring things for the Florida Gators. Payne, I don't want to oversimplify the handicap here, and Brad talked about Florida and how they've struggled offensively. They're not going to be able to run the football if they're chasing a deficit. Is this game just boiled down to how effective Georgia can be against the Florida Gators defense that for extended stretches has shown a ton of vulnerability? No greater illustration than the last time we saw them out there giving up 6 touchdowns on 6 consecutive drives against the LSU Tigers in a game played at Ben Hill Griffin Stadium?
I think that's probably the angle here when you're looking at a number this high. It's how many stops can Florida get? And I know that was kind of the focal point of the preseason preview, and really any time we've broken down a Gators game aside from popping the bubble on Anthony Richardson was Florida's issues in the trenches on the defensive side of the ball. And through 8 weeks, that area of concern might be worse than anticipated coming into the season. I mean, Florida just doesn't have the guys on the interior of the defensive line. They don't create a lot of havoc. They don't create a lot of negative plays in the run game. They're outside the top 90 in both defensive line yards and stuff rate. More than 47% of runs against Florida have graded successful, and it's led to a defense that's outside the top 100 in EPA per rush allowed. And you look at like the big fella there, Desmond Watson at 430 pounds. He's supposed to be that guy to help Gervon Dexter because we know what Dexter is inside. Maybe the bye week gets Watson back into form, but I think Watson's overall stamina has kind of hindered his play the last 3 games pre-bye. Watson was fantastic the first month, right? But against Eastern Washington, Missouri, and LSU, he's combined to have a negative grade on average in those 3 games. So you need Desmond Watson to step up here. All signs are pointing to having Kendall Milton back for Georgia in their backfield. Some whispers about improving the O-line with some changes during the bye. Would not be shocked if Amarius Mims sees more snaps this week. But right now, Georgia, you look at their offense, certainly not as explosive the last couple of weeks through the air. They've had some receiver injuries there with AD. But on the ground, top 10 in adjusted line yards, top 10 standard down line yards, top 20 in opportunity rate and stuff rate allowed. Over 52% of Georgia's rushing yards have come before first contact this season, and it's led to a Georgia run game that's top 10 in both EPA and success rate. So by all measures, this appears to be a real matchup advantage for Georgia on this side of the ball, and if Georgia can build a lead with its run game and then force Anthony Richardson to pass in known situations with a very meager receiving group, we've kind of seen this movie before.
Yeah, I mean, you look at some of Georgia's numbers, and I know they had their wake-up call against Missouri where they had to slip by the Tigers in Columbia deep into that fourth quarter. I mean, you highlighted some of those things. You know, knowing how many of their rushing yards have been picked up before first contact, absolutely staggering, and it's contributed to the fact that, you know, Georgia's been able to gain 66% of all available offensive yards. 19% of their drives have graded out explosive. I mean, more than 60% of their drives pick up 2+ first downs. Success rates off the charts, and when you look at just the counting stats, 526 yards per game is second in the country behind only Tennessee. And I don't think anybody out there goes, yeah, I think about Georgia's offense in the same vein as Tennessee and their ability to pick up chunk yardage. Fourth in the FBS in terms of yards per play at 7.26. Now, Florida, I know, no slouch in that department, but the Gators obviously give quite a bit up defensively. The last thing on this game, Brad, that I want to ask, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we get deeper into the season as well. We know narratives play such a big role for rivalry games. People get a little bit squeamish about laying big points. Do you factor any of that in, or no, it's, hey, look, it's pure X's and O's, it's pure numbers? Like, you don't think you're going to get a Herculean effort from little brother stepping up in class if they just don't have the dogs?
It's interesting you use the term little brother, because that is one where I did get involved, and I this week, the big brother, little brother, not this rivalry, it didn't factor into this handicap, even though it's an historical point spread for Georgia. I just don't see the pathway to much success here for Florida. But it does from time to time. It's always a case-by-case basis for me. Where it did impact this week and it came into play was Michigan State, just because I've seen the last 2 decades of the series. And I even though my numbers say Michigan should be more than a 3-touchdown favorite, I have not seen it at any point in the last 2 decades, Michigan getting margin on Michigan State. So that one I did play, just specifically series history, and also some bright spots for Michigan State. So that's a good question. It does, as we get closer to rivalry week, I do. I mean, if you're just saying I don't have a specific take or you know, an angle coming into the game, I'm always going to lean more towards the bigger dog that could step up and play one of their better games of the year.
It makes a ton of sense, and we talk about it all the time. Styles make fights, and it comes up probably more often than not in service academy games when you look at power numbers and going, all right, 17 in a game between an Army and Navy is a little bit different than 17 between Tennessee and a Georgia, theoretically, where you could have a higher point total, just to kind of use that as loose illustration. So just some of those little nuances that we know going to this process. We know it's not always formulaic. You know, A plus B equals C. There's a little bit of art form and science at arriving at some investments each week during the college football season. You can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. Follow Payne there as well, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. And most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Brad, before we bid you a fond farewell for yet another great performance here in terms of breaking down some of the marquee games, anything else you'd like to include, shots you'd want to take at Payne or myself in any capacity before we let you get back into the lab to try and dig and add another 40 positions, I'm sure, to your rapidly growing resume for this Saturday?
Actually, I'm going to pay a compliment to Payne. So I'm going to pull behind the curtain here. It's 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning here. And with all of Payne's different business enterprises, all the different sports he handicaps and bets on, all the different lady friends that he has to keep track of, I get this text at 6 a.m. about a first half FCS total that I should be betting. So I just want the listeners to know that, hey, man, Payne is really on top of it. He's dedicated. He's passionate. He's a grinder. And I don't come across that too often. Now, I mean, full disclosure, it was a big time loser, but it's all about the process. It's all about the process over the picks. So, and it had some very significant CLV. I'll put it that way. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It stunned me, to be honest with you, that Payne was on top of something like that.
You know, Payne, do you want a chance for a rebuttal here?
Sheesh. Well, no, I mean, I appreciate the compliment up until the end there. But and what was crazy to me is I was looking at this game and I said, I'm going to be able to fall asleep because I see the full games at 61.5, and I'm going to be able to wake up and come back to a relatively similar number. And I look, and it had moved 10 points overnight. And I immediately text Brad, was this you? And he goes, biggest bet of the week. And I said, let me poke around here because I still see some 30s in the first half. And at this point, I mean, yeah, it wasn't close. I didn't watch it. And I'll be honest, the way I found out the game lost is I got notified that Brad sent a tweet. And the tweet was like, what was it, 50 points in the first half, something along those lines. And I was like, I didn't even need to watch the game. So I have no idea what unfolded there. But there was substantial weather, and I think I think our first half under is where the full game closed, and somehow we still lost.
Pretty much.
Brad, I love the fact here that Payne goes out of his way to make sure that people know he didn't watch an FCS game when about 25 minutes ago he told people he didn't like watching college football in general. So I'd be slightly more concerned if he tuned into that particular game of the entire slate on a Saturday than watching some of the bigger games that go on from noon Eastern until the wee hours of the morning on the West Coast.
I mean, money can influence even the best of us. So I mean, that might require some viewership if your pocketbook and your overall well-being as far as the weekend goes.
Because I love you guys so much, it is my job to play the role of college football idiot here. Okay?
Is there a follow-up to that, or was it just that was it? It was college football idiot, and boom, I'm going to leave it at that.
I'm a point guard. I'm supposed to make everyone else on the floor look elite. Okay?
Brad, this is where we cut him off, and we go, man, you know what, Payne? The show's run a little bit long. I think we've exceeded our quota for a college football Wednesday. Brad, we know you got a ton of other things to do. Appreciate your time with us each and every Wednesday throughout the season. Best of luck this weekend with all of your college football investments, both on the FBS and apparently on the FCS total trail. Well.
Thank you, guys. Talk to you again next week.
Look at you and Brad having a nice little text exchange at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning, landing on an FCS first half total. I need to get in on this group text, apparently.
It's not a group text. It was just, hey.
Well, three would make it a group.
Hold on a second.
Me getting involved.
Let's back up this truck a little bit.
Yeah, you sent me the game. I know. I got it.
I sent you the game. I sent you the game Friday night.
You did. You did tell me this was the game that we had eyes on.
You were at dinner. You were, I don't know what the heck you were doing. Mickey Mouse on Ice. Whatever your Friday endeavors lead you to.
Disney on Ice isn't here yet. At least I don't think I've been to one of those. I haven't been to one of those in a long time. I haven't even been to a Golden Knights game so far this season. I think this Friday.
What's going on with that?
Well, I mean, we're busy. We're creating content at an extremely high level, so it precludes me from leaving the house most days. But I think this Friday will be the first time I get to T-Mobile for the first game in our new seats for the Golden Knights. We got a 3 p.m. puck drop in the middle of the afternoon for Nevada Day. I think I may have to make my maiden voyage.
There's so many things that I could discuss. One is that you now have this frozen piece of water in Nevada and Mickey on Ice is not there yet. Two, What time is this game?
3 p.m. in the afternoon.
On what day?
Friday afternoon.
Friday. Okay. And then third, I understand you're getting a little bit better about not leaving, but Friday evening is like your go out night. This is what sustains the relationship. So
exactly.
When I sent
Friday,
this to you, you were likely out.
Oh, here we
go. Now pretending forward facing that I didn't send it to you.
No, you sent it to me. You told me this game was on the radar. I looked at it. I went, okay, I can see where they're coming from. There should be some nasty weather there. First half total, I didn't have access to in that particular market. And, it is what it is. I mean, I know how this works as a full-blown collaboration. We all pull ourselves in separate directions. We land on some of the same games. Every now and again, we go rogue. And I do appreciate you boys keeping me in the loop for some of these FCS gems that I don't necessarily delve into on a week-in, week-out basis.
There we go.
So I'm sorry if you felt that you were unfairly catching collateral and shrapnel or whatever the terminology, collateral damage as the term may be. Yes, we pull in harmony with one another, even if Brad decides he wants to move on certain games before he gives us a heads up.
Yes. Is that where we're heading now? Is that where?
Do we want to head there? Is there anything else you want to talk about? Your preferred nutrition regimen, what the workout schedule looks like during football season. I mean, we can go in a variety of different ways.
First workout yesterday since the Wednesday in Nashville with you. I mean, it has been tough getting back on track sleep-wise. It's been tough getting back on track with the green juice regimen. I mean, it's been a tough transition.
Hey, you've been able to dodge the bug. I mean, I'm trying to fight through a little bit of adversity here. The cold finally took me down. A little sore throat, little
doesn't surprise me.
Stuffy in the nasal capacity. When you have a weak constitution, this is what happens. I know. I know how this goes. I understand the shots that you're going to fire in my general direction, but hey,
I didn't say the word shot. That was you.
I'm here to bear the weight of the world and understand that in this business, you have to be regimented, you have to be a creature of habit and find a way to adhere to that so you can keep everything copacetic. But all right, we do have one final order of business to transact, and it's identifying the most actionable opportunity above and beyond all of the in-depth breakdowns where I'm sure our listeners know where we've kind of tipped our hand to some things that may or may not be on the radar for us this weekend. So, my good man, where are you taking us this fine Saturday?
Unlike many of the bets that we've given out when we've just been struck with negative variance. Hopefully the football gods are a little bit kinder. We don't see third-string quarterbacks. And I'll be honest here, Todd. We talked about this game yesterday and could have got 6 minus 15, and I said I kind of want to give this out on the podcast, and I'm not going to bet it quite yet. Someone else had different plans, and one of those gentlemen was on this podcast earlier. I do love him, though. So there's still value in this game. I still like it. Our core number on it is a shade under 2. Let's go with rotation number 127, the Missouri Tigers, +4, still available. If you have access to things out in Vegas, there's even some 4.5s there. But it's the Missouri Tigers. And when I look at this game, they've played a strength of schedule that leaves some of their metrics not as poorly as you might think. Obviously, there's been some discussions about their offense being a little bit lackluster, and by no means is it good. But it's still in the 60 range in terms of EPA per play. It's better than that in explosiveness when you adjust for schedule. We've seen Missouri go toe-to-toe with Georgia at home, built a double-digit lead in that game. They went on the road to Auburn. I know they lost on the scoreboard, but should have won that game as well. Fumbled the ball through the end zone late in that one. They played Florida extremely tough in the swamp, came back home against Vanderbilt, and there was heavy winds there, and so they didn't look great. But again, another game that's a little bit misleading because Vanderbilt had a defensive score there. I am not buying South Carolina football right now, and I think that's the ultimate thing here. I do like Missouri a little bit better. They have an elite defense, so they have, to me, the best unit in this game, but it's also a sell of South Carolina. And you look at what they've done just the last handful of weeks. wildly outplayed against A&M. I believe the first 17 points they scored came on what, Todd? Maybe a grand total of less than 75 yards against A&M. We all thought
75 might be generous, honestly.
Yes.
Let me pull up the box score now while you continue to go through the breakdown.
We all thought that A&M, just the vibe of that game, was going to battle their way back. A lot of sharp professional money on A&M in the second half of that game. Got out, went on a little bit of a drive to start the break and fizzled out in plus territory. And then all of a sudden, Haynes King, the backup quarterback, injures himself without any contact, just throwing a ball, reaches for the chest and arm, and suddenly we have a third-string freshman quarterback in the game on the road in a hostile environment trying to play catch-up. And the week prior, or a couple weeks prior, right against Kentucky, it's no Will Levis. So I think when you look at South Carolina, quite the fraud. And I think this game has the potential to close much lower. Again, our number is just a shade below 2 on this one. So getting some supreme value through the 3 here.
I knew 75 sounded generous, Payne. South Carolina returned the opening kickoff, and that drive got started there. They had a 23-yard field goal that came on a drive where 4 plays covered 0 yards. And then they extended their lead to 17-0 on a drive that covered all of 19 yards. 4 plays, 19 yards. So
17 points on 19 yards. Little deceptive. Okay.
Yeah. So makes you feel a little bit better. And to your point, talking about Missouri, there is no doubt one of the worst run defenses in the country last year went through a little bit of a transformation, and it's carried over to this year where they've been extremely stout on that side of the ball, capable of forcing a turnover or a short field. I'm right there with you. I think Missouri not only covers this game, but wins it outright in Columbia, knowing that this is actually a little bit of a letdown. I mean, South Carolina, you look at that environment that you saw Saturday night, Williams-Brice Stadium under the lights can be a little bit underrated, kind of like Carter Finley is in the ACC for NC State. They talked about how it was the first program win over Texas A&M in school history. Would not be shocked whatsoever if you get Missouri's best punch here against a South Carolina team that may be focused on some other pursuits. So let's get the Missouri Tigers to the window outright as an underdog. Anything else that you would like to share with our loyal listeners before we bid them a fond farewell on a college football Wednesday around the Bet the Board home offices?
No. I think we've gone through the gauntlet. We talked some ESPN, Fox Sports type stuff at the top with Brad, which I actually thought was a very good conversation, more intelligent, because you can incorporate some of the spreads into those debates of who the top 4 truly are. And I think we broke down the games very well today, and then it's just about getting Missouri +4 to the window. So that's it.
I'm not going to lie.
Dodge. NFL tomorrow.
Games like Tennessee and Kentucky fascinate me a ton when you get the contrast in styles, and I think that game, clearly the marquee game of the day, maybe not because of a point spread or potential for outright upset, but just to see how Kentucky goes about trying to slow down Tennessee's offense, and if they use the offense to control the pace, or if they try and match them score for score, an area where they came up just a bit short when they did battle last year. For Payne Insider, follow him on Twitter. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. More importantly, follow the podcast at the Bet the Board Pod, and of course, Brad Powers as well at Brad Powers 7. Best of luck with all of your college football Week 9 investments, and with a Missouri Tigers ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.